real quick, we have a guest speaker. I had a couple quick people come in. All right. People muted. All right. So just a couple real quick announcements for people that might be have interest. The the right screen. It's weird. Switch. Sorry. I don't have my own team's trouble. All right. Let's be super quick. There we are. All right. So there's Center Innovation Fund call. You're if you want to propose, it's due by August 6th. So the thing is on today at Glenn. If you have questions, reach out to me or reach out directly to Kurt Sackstetter. And on that note, the NASA Today at Glenn website is a whole wing, our whole internal web internet is going to change. Say, there's, if you want to participate in describing how you think it should change, there's a survey open. You can go respond to that. And then finally, they've added the security training to your thing. It's due the end of September, and as is the controlled unclassified information training. Most people have not done either of them. And these are ones that for which they will turn off your computer access for either one of them. So I encourage you to do them before the end of mid-August, just so because it'll slow down the nagging emails that, or at least you won't get them. But anyway, you got to get them done. There's no appeal process. So, and that's it. Dennis, you want to do the introductions?
Sure, I can do that. So I met Andrew at National Boy Scout events where we were both serving on staff. I was representing NASA and Andrew was serving on medical staff. And anyway, he shared his passion and happy and closely tracking human spaceflight. And that's the topic of his presentation today.
And he's besides being a Boy Scout, his background is the faculty at Penn State. So,
yeah.
Okay. All right. So without further ado, let's go ahead. I forgot. If you want to go to the ASGSR, you've got to get yourself into TTC, particularly contractors, and they should also get TFAWs. Any contract, you got to get yourself in the TTC. Email Kármán to get yourself added. All right, if you're the contractor. Thanks.
Can everybody see this?
Yep.
See my slide?
Affirmative.
Oh, good. So the training sounds just like here. You have to do it, no appeals. And thank you, especially Dennis, for helping set this up. I am a scouter like him. I'm not wearing my uniform right now, but I am wearing my scout socks. That's how you tell a real scouter. So anyway, again, thanks everybody for this. I tried to do this over a year ago in person. I'd really like to do it in person, but I think this will work even after the delay. I'm actually a pediatric oncologist. So you're wondering why a pediatric oncologist is lecturing to a bunch of NASA engineers about human spaceflight. But I'm also an engineer myself. My original degree is in electrical engineering. And I've never really given that up. I've always kept that up, and it's been in the background. But more than that, I consider myself a child of the space age. I was born in 1955, and probably some of you were born about the same time. Always been very interested in space flight of all kinds, human space flight especially. And I've cut a lot of classes to see liftoffs and flybys and so on. But I was born before any human spaceflight at all. I don't think. See if I can go to my second slide there. Yeah, I don't think I remember the first spaceflight in 1957. I was about 2 years old, not even that. But I think I have vague memories of Yuri Gagarin's 1961 orbit of the Earth. It would be very vague, but ever since then I've paid very close attention. And I'm sure like many of you. I also I've always had a love of spreadsheets. I've followed all of these space flights over the years, and I thought at one point, wouldn't it be neat to have a spreadsheet and a graph showing the number of people in space over time? And originally I thought, well, somebody else must have done it. So I searched and searched and couldn't find that anybody had done it, or at least had posted it at all. So I started doing it myself, and this was probably 20 years ago or so, just to see what it would look like. And I kept it to myself, and it was kind of interesting. And this is actually the first 5 years of a graph of human spaceflight. And if you know your history, you can see on here and identify some of those flights. This is, of course, Yuri Gagarin's. You can see my mouse, right? The first space flight, one orbit of Earth, and then we had two of the Mercury Redstone flights with Alan Shepard and Gus Grissom, and this is a little bit longer. This one is John Glenn's 3 orbits of the Earth. But these are just individual, very short flights. It's not that interesting a graph, actually. This is actually a double mission, 2 Russian missions at the same time, each with 1 person, same as this one. This flight is actually the first multi-person spacecraft. It was a Vostok, and there were 3 people on board. So this does look kind of interesting, and I just kept putting flights in from the past and keeping this spreadsheet up and keeping this database and seeing what the graph looked like. And again, this was well after these flights had happened. And it was pretty easy because you just kept to look at the flight, how many people were aboard, and how long it was aloft. But then I ran into this flight, and this one had some problems in order to keep the data straight. This was a big milestone in spaceflight when 2 Soyuzes launched on just a few days apart, one with 1 cosmonaut, the other with 3, and they linked together, but there was no port between them. So their goal was to transfer people from one spacecraft to another, and they did that successfully. But they had to open both hatches. 2 cosmonauts climbed out of one and then moved over to the other, hooked up to the other. There actually is there's no video of this. There was planned to be video, but they got so confused and caught in their tethers that they forgot to turn the video on. So there's no recording of this. But what happened here is the Soyuz 4 launched with 1 person. Soyuz 5 launched the next day with 3 people, and they switched 2 people and came down. Soyuz 4 started with 1, ended with 3. Soyuz 5 started with 3, ended with 1. This made things much harder for me because I no longer had to keep track of just the missions, but I had to keep track of each individual person on each mission. But I figured that out and kept on going with the spreadsheet and the graph. So the heart of this talk is to show those graphs of the now 22,000 plus days in space. Before I do that, though, I have to make some definitions. Otherwise, you won't know exactly what I'm talking about. And the most controversial and most question about those is, what is the definition of a space flight? How high do you have to go? And if you've been watching the news, that's been in the news lately. What is actually a space flight? So what is the definition of space? For my data, I'm using what's called the Kármán line. And I guess some of you, again, if you've been paying attention to the news, you'll know what that is. It's the most accepted altitude for the definition of space. The Kármán line was invented by Theodor von Kármán, who's a Hungarian-American engineer physicist, and he did a thought experiment and the calculations behind it. Obviously, if a plane flies, it gets lift aerodynamically through Bernoulli's principle, and has to fly a certain speed to get that lift. And as it ascends, the atmosphere gets thinner, so it has to go faster. And what he reasoned was the higher the airplane goes, the faster it has to go. And at some point, it has to go so fast to get lift because the atmosphere is so thin that it achieves orbital velocity. And he calculated that occurs at somewhere above 80 kilometers. And for some reason, the Kármán line, named after him, was defined as 100 kilometers because it varies a little bit from year to year what altitude that is. That's a very interesting definition to me, but it's not very practical. But because he did that, that's been the most accepted definition of space since. Most of the world subscribes to that. The Kármán line, 100 kilometers. If you don't hit 100 kilometers, you're not in space. If you're over 100 kilometers, you are in space. An example, Spaceship One, the Virgin Galactic first iteration of the plane that Branson took a few weeks ago, won the Ansari X Prize by satisfying the criteria. They made 3 flights to 100 kilometers. 2 of them had to be within a certain amount of time, a few weeks apart, and they got the $10 million for that. Those flights are in my data because they did pass the Kármán line. Now, it's pretty much accepted, but of course not universally. The country that doesn't, of course, is the United States. The US does not accept the Kármán line. They have a lower limit. They say 50 miles or about 80 kilometers for the United States. So, and the reason they do that is twofold. Number one, they wanted to give astronaut wings to their X-15 pilots, who many of them exceeded 80 kilometers, but only a very few of them exceeded 100. And the other reason is probably physical, is that really the space probably begins below the Kármán line, below 100 kilometers. I think pretty much people agree with that. But where does the atmosphere end is much higher than 100 kilometers. So it's not the same place. In fact, nobody orbits at 100 kilometers. It would decay too much because they're too fast, because there's too much atmosphere there. In fact, the space station is at about 250. The Starlink satellites that are coming up by SpaceX, they're at 550. And even there is enough atmospheric drag that those satellites will eventually decay. So there's disagreement about exactly where space begins and where the atmosphere ends. The other reason I picked this is I'm interested in orbital technology. I really want to exclude the space planes and the ballistic flights. They're not part of what I'm looking at here. But I couldn't just arbitrarily exclude them, because there are many of them that are very important and that were clearly in space. For example, the 2 first Mercury Redstone flights, were well above 100 kilometers. They were ballistic flights. They didn't have the energy to get into space, but they need to be included because that is orbital technology. I would have liked to exclude just individual ones, but I can't. That's kind of an arbitrary definition, and I couldn't just pick my own elevation like 120 kilometers, because then I'd be kind of on my own. So I use 100 kilometers. Spaceship Two, the Unity spacecraft that just went up a few weeks ago, is not in my data because it only goes to about 90 or 85 kilometers. But the trip that just went on Tuesday, New Glenn, is in my data because it makes a big point of hitting 100 kilometers. But this is a little bit controversial. And that's why I made that decision. Other than that, the other decisions are not so much arbitrary. I'm using universal time for all the events. It wouldn't make any sense at all to use local time. I have an example here that shows that the dates are a little bit different. If you look at universal time versus local time, again, I use universal. That's what's usually posted, and it's again the same all over the Earth. There's an example here, but when I show you the graphs, if you're in space for even a few minutes, that counts as a person being in space for that day. But of course, when I start doing calculations such as miles traveled in space or hours in space, that wouldn't work, because if you only make one orbit, you're only there for 90 minutes. So for the calculations, I count launch and landing as a half day. So if you launch and land on the same day, you get no credit. For example, if you launch on January 1st and land on January 2nd, that's counted as 1 day in space, even though that flight could technically be a few minutes long to almost 48 hours. And so I'm trying to avoid a systematic error there. But in the graph, just a simple few minutes above the Kármán line counts. I define a vehicle as a program. So in other words, Mercury, there were 6 separate manned spacecraft, but I don't count them all separately. I count the Mercury program. The Soyuz, the same thing. I'm counting that as one program, one vehicle, even though there have been multiple upgrades and hundreds of flights by the various Soyuz programs. Space Shuttle, there were 5 different vehicles. Again, I count them all as one program. And then space stations are a little bit different. There are many of them. China's had 3. For my data, it doesn't really matter. I just have to put people somewhere for every day. So it doesn't matter if I count them on one or another, as long as they're in space. Of course, talking about the people traveling in one vehicle and coming down in another, it's a common thing now. I mean, most flights, people transfer from vehicle to space station back to another vehicle. Some people go up in one vehicle, transfer to a station, and come home in another vehicle. But I just have to put them somewhere so I keep them on, keep the graph straight. And then one simple definition, when I talk about the number of people flying, it's not the number of people who have traveled in space. It's each flight containing a person counts as a person. For example, John Glenn flew twice, and so he counts as 2 people, just to be clear about what I mean by the number of people who've traveled to space. So again, this is an example. I don't need to talk about this much, but Mercury 1 launched and landed on the same day. It's counted as no person days on my calculations, but it is counted on the graph. And this one is just a space station flight, crew of 5, was in space for actually 5 full days, but because launch and landing are actually parts of 6 days, so they're on the graph as 6 days, but 5 people for the difference between the landing and the launch is 5 days, so it's 25 person days here. But in the graph, there it's counted as 6 parts of 6 days, or counts as 5 days here. Anyway, I've explained that basically I don't want to overcount launch as a full day and landing as a full day. And then a launch is just any flight which reaches over 100 kilometers, regardless of the trajectory. As long as they're 100 kilometers, that counts. And for example, the first 2 Mercury flights were suborbital, but well over the Kármán line, so they count. They didn't have the energy to reach space. It was Mercury Redstone, not Mercury Atlas. This is John Glenn's flight, 3 orbits, reached well over the Kármán line. That counts as well. This is one of the X-15 flights, suborbital, reached over the Kármán line. So this is one of the few X-15 flights that counts. There is only one suborbital flight that was unintentionally suborbital, and I'll talk about that later. This was a Soyuz flight that had a booster problem. Again, it counts as a space flight, but it was suborbital. So I need to include these in my data. This was orbital technology. And by the way, the difference in the energy required in the suborbital flights versus the orbital flights is vast. The orbital flights have a 60 times energy, 60 times velocity to reach space. So like, for example, this X-15 flight and the recent flights by the Unity spacecraft had barely enough energy to reach space, but not nearly enough energy, like 1/60th of what's needed to go into orbit. My data source was mostly Wikipedia. They use universal time. They use a standard format. It's very easy to collect the data. It has all the names, all the nationalities. I don't really care about the nationalities of the individuals. I care about the nationality of the vehicle. So, for example, when the U.S. launches 4 people aboard a Dragon, and one of them is Japanese, that counts as a U.S. Person because it's U.S. technology launching that person. I did find one mistake in a landing date of an Apollo flight, and I corrected with NASA.gov. I do refer to other sources, and I did correct that. So let me talk briefly about the vehicles before I show the graphs. This is all the vehicles that have been to space stations and launch vehicles. 3 countries have launched them: USA, USSR, Russia, and China. There's 11 human launch vehicles. 2 of them are purely suborbital. They're included in my data. As again, they did reach the Kármán line, Spaceship One and X-15. And 7 are purely orbital. That is, they've never made suborbital flights, but they're launch vehicles. Mercury and Soyuz, of course, have made both orbital and suborbital flights. And then there are the space stations, again, from the 3 countries. And the lunar excursion model, of course, is a special case. By country, there's 3 countries and the multinational ones. This is a busy slide because the U.S. has had so many launch vehicles. I think we're up to like 8 now. Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, now, of course, Dragon. They've had 1 space station, the space shuttle, of course, and the 2 suborbital ones that have reached the Kármán line. Much simpler is USSR and Russia. They've only had 3 launch vehicles. Briefly, Vostok, that's the first few. That's Yuri Gagarin's first orbit. And then the Voskhod for just a few years. And then ever since, it's been Soyuz. That's the only craft that they have now available, and I don't think they're developing anymore. They've had 2 space stations, Salyut in many iterations, and of course Mir, which we participated on, but was a Russian built ship entirely. And then China, even simpler, all their launches have been via Shenzhou. And they've only had 7. Looks very much like Soyuz, and that's kind of on purpose. And they've had several space stations, Tiangong, which stands for Heavenly Palace, and now they're actually building a multi-module space station, which they call Tiangong also. And then, of course, the multinational, there's really only 2, the International Space Station, of course, and the Apollo-Soyuz test project, this little module here being the only international part, so they could transfer between. And basically, they just exchanged a few gifts and shook hands. So now I'm going to show you the heart of the talk. That's the graphs themselves. Then I'll talk about some of the other data that can be mined from the spreadsheet that I've made. And then a little bit about spaceflight safety at the end. And I'm going to show the graphs in several portions by decade, mostly the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, then the first 20 years of the millennium. And then I'm going to show what it looks like to show the entire 22,000 days on one graph, and then a more broken apart one of just the recent activity of the last 2 years. So this is the first graph. This is the first 10 years of human spaceflight. And again, you can see it's just mostly a bunch of short, spiky things with individual flights and no long duration trips. To orient you, this is on the x-axis is every year, and on the y-axis is the number of people in space on that day. And you can see the maximum here on this graph is 8. And again, if you know your history, you can start picking things out. And in general, look at this. This is Mercury, 1 person, Gemini, 2 people, Apollo, 3 people, some of the other flights in between. But to help you, I've added some labels here. So again, this is Yuri Gagarin's first flight, April 12, 1961. Maybe I remember it, maybe I don't. It's interesting that he made an orbit, but he landed and he launched to the east like everybody does, but he actually landed to the west of where he launched. But he's given credit for one orbit, and I would give him credit for one orbit, because in the 90 minutes that he was up, the Earth rotated underneath him, so he didn't make it quite back to his landing place, but he did travel far enough to be counted as one orbit. Here are our first two flights. They were suborbital, Shepard and Grissom. And then, here's Glenn's flight here, 3 orbits, right? Here's the 2 X-15 flights that made it to 100 kilometers, Flight 90 and Flight 91. Suborbital, nowhere near enough energy to attain orbit. I have up here a little bit of a key. All the suborbital flights are in purple. Green is the orbital flights. And when there's a fatality, I have it in red, and there's a number of asterisks for the number of people that died on that flight. You can see that here we had 2 Geminis up to demonstrate 2 spacecraft in flight at the same time, 4 people. This is that Soyuz flight that I talked about, where they actually transferred people from one to another. That made me redo the whole the way I was collecting data. You can see here the first Apollo flights. It's Apollo 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, of course. That's the landing on the moon. And 12. First, one of the things I want to point out here is that there's some interesting stuff you see about the way we run our space program here. And this is where you can start to see how the graph kind of puts the history of spaceflight in perspective. The way the U.S. has done stuff is we have a program, and we let that program end before the next program is open. So you can see that Mercury ended here, and there's a gap before we started the Gemini program. And the same thing happened after Gemini. Gemini ended, Apollo wasn't ready, so there's a gap of actually several years before we're ready to go. And that was compounded by Apollo 1, which was not intended to be a space flight. It was a research vehicle, but there were people on board testing systems. It wasn't called Apollo 1 until the fire that killed Grissom, Chaffee, and White. And 3 people died in that. And because of that, and because of the fact that Apollo wasn't really ready to fly, there's this huge gap in here. I also have the other 2 fatalities that are important in the 60s. Soyuz 1 was the first flight of a Soyuz. And Yuri Gagarin did not fly on that. He wanted to. He was considered a hero, obviously, in Russia. He really wanted to fly on that, partly because he knew that the craft wasn't ready, and he thought it was too dangerous. And if he was the one flying, they probably would have canceled it. Well, they wouldn't let him fly. They never let him fly again because he was too much of a hero. And indeed, he was right. The parachute failed to open. It was a successful space flight, so there is a point on the graph for it. But if the parachute failed to open and he impacted the ground, I can't remember the name of the cosmonaut, but he died on impact. It's one of only 2 Soyuz fatal flights. And then I have the X-15, this one X-15 fatal flight here as well, because this is technology that is capable of space flight, so I have it included on here. This flight actually did hit 80 kilometers, so the pilot did receive his astronaut wings by U.S. criteria posthumously. So this is the first 10 years of human spaceflight. Let's go to the next 10 years in the 70s. Again, I have this labeled, and you can see 8 is the maximum here also. Here's the other Apollo flights, Apollo 13, 14, 15, one of these is 16, and that's 17. That's all of Apollo. This is the other Soviet fatal flight, Soyuz 11. 3 people died on this. In fact, they're the only people that ever died in space. The other people either died on the way to space or on the way back from space. But these people died actually coming back. They were connected to a space station. They disconnected and a valve opened, letting out all their air, and they asphyxiated. But they had actually fired their deorbit burn, so they were on their way back. So they didn't die in orbit, but they did die in space. Here's the 3 Skylab missions. They were Apollo capsules launching, and you can see Skylab 1, Skylab 2, and Skylab 3 progressively longer. And here's a Soyuz flight in the middle of that. So 5 people were in space on a particular day or a few days. This is the, I talked about Soyuz 18-1 earlier. This is the only launch that was suborbital, and it's purple here, suborbital unintentionally. All the other suborbital flights were intended to be so. This flight reached space, but had a booster separation problem, and it did reach space, but didn't have enough energy and had to come back. The 2 cosmonauts that were on board this were very shaken up, landed in an uninhabited area, very mountainous. The craft almost fell off a cliff. The parachute saved them. One of the cosmonauts was so shaken up and injured that he never flew again. But they both survived it, and that points out that if you look at spaceflight, there are so many mishaps that occurred that were not fatal and were surprisingly not fatal. You think of that, just a few fatal flights, but there were many that I'm surprised that people actually survived it. Here's the Apollo-Soyuz test project. Again, this was a record at the time. 7 people in space. That's because there was another flight going on at the same time. Salyut 4 was a space station that had 2 Russians aboard it. So the Apollo-Soyuz test project had 3 people aboard the Apollo capsule and 2 people aboard the Soyuz, but there are actually people on Salyut at the same time. So there were 7 people in space for a brief period. Here's the 3rd decade, the 80s. First flight of the Space Transportation System or the Space Shuttle. And you can see that they ramped up quite a bit. Lots of flights of the Space Shuttle. They weren't building the space station yet. But here's one of 2 U.S. fatalities. 7 people died aboard Challenger. And I have it down here because it was not a space flight. They died well under the Kármán line, but it was an intended space flight. So I included it here as a space flight, but it's not on the graph because they did not reach space. And just like that, after Mercury, after Gemini, and after Apollo, there was a dearth of space flights. I call those mission deserts, where there weren't a lot of missions because the U.S. was between programs. Same thing happened here. Look at all these space shuttle flights. Look what happened here after Challenger. Suddenly there's many fewer people in space. There's a big gap in here. Only flights were to Mir, Russian space station, short duration and longer duration, actually quite a long duration of several years of continuous habitation. And then they left Mir and came back up. But here the space shuttle begins to fly again, but a big gap in here. And you'll see this at other scales when I show it. This is the 1990s. Again, continuous or very frequent space station flights. These are research missions and a lot of missions to Mir. The space shuttle did fly to Mir, and very long continuous human operation here aboard Mir with Soyuz flights and shuttle flights to Mir. I'm going to point out this day later. This is one of only a couple days that there were 2 launches on the same day. With all these launches, that's only happened twice. This is the deployment of the Hubble, and this is the repairs of the Hubble. Several of them. International Space Station construction begins here. This is John Glenn's 2nd flight. You see things get more complicated here. This is 20 years, and you can see that now we have the y-axis goes up to 14 because there are often 13 people in orbit. In fact, that's up until just last week. That was the record: 13 people in orbit or in space at the same time. That's held for a long time, but starting October 31st, 2000, we've had continuous presence in space aboard the space station. This is the second U.S. fatality. This is Columbia. That was a space flight, of course. They were in space and died on the way back. Here's a couple more Hubble services. And again, look at this. This is the final shuttle flight. After that, again, kind of a mission desert. These are all Soyuz flights. U.S. has nothing when a program ends. We have nothing to take its place. So the Russians, on the other hand, have done things differently. They've transitioned from one to the other more smoothly. Now, Soyuz has been upgraded many, many times, but what they do is they don't stop flying the previous version until the new version is ready. So they have more continuous operation. This is another fatal flight. This is the Virgin Galactic Enterprise, the first version of the Spaceship Two Unity that flew last week. I include this here. This is questionably orbital or questionably space technology because it was never intended to hit the Kármán line, but it does go above 50 miles. So these pilots do get their space wings, and the passengers, like Richard Branson, he got his space wings by the U.S. criteria. This is the only flight of a space-worthy vehicle that had a fatality in which there was also a survivor. The pilot, one of them died, one of them did not. Every other fatal flight, everybody died on. This is the other suborbital technology, Spaceship One, winning the Ansari Prize. They flew here to get above the Kármán line because that was the criteria. And then this is actually two flights in order to win the prize. They had to get two flights within a few weeks of each other. Now let's look at a 20-year period. Actually, this is the most recent one. It shows just some good detail of just the last 2 years, from the 1st of 2020 to my cutoff date of July 5th. Now, there's been one flight since July 5th, but because it takes me so long to upgrade these graphs, I had to pick a day. And so the most recent flight is not there, and that's significant for several reasons. But this is the most recent activity, less than about a year and a half of activity. I have the launches and landings of each flight here. So this is 6 people aboard the International Space Station. Soyuz MS-13 comes home with 3, leaves 3 people aboard. MS-14 is not on here because it was an unmanned technology proving mission. So there is no MS-14 manned mission. MS-16 launches, and then MS-15 comes home. They do things a little differently now. What used to be is a flight would come home, leaving 3 people aboard the space station, and then the next flight would come up. Now they actually fly the replacement mission before the flight comes home. That's why things are so high over here. But this is Dragon Demo 2. This is Bob Hurley and Doug and Bob's first flight on Dragon. This is their entire mission here, their launch and their landing. And then MS-17 comes up with 3 people, 6 people here. MS-16 comes home. And then this is Dragon Crew 1 coming aboard, of course, with 4 people. So now there are 7 people aboard. MS-18 then launches, leaving 10 people aboard the space station briefly. MS-17 comes home. Dragon Demo 2 is up there now. They came up, and before Dragon Demo 1 came home. So 4 people up, 4 people down. This is the 7 people that are kind of the base up there. And then recently, the Chinese are now building their space station. They put the space station up, and they had 3 people aboard it. So there are currently 10 people in space, 7 aboard the space station, and 3 aboard the Chinese space station. So there are 10 people. up until, so the 13 has been the record until very recently. And 13 makes sense, 13 people in space, because that's 6 people on the space station and 7 people aboard the space shuttle. So when it was docked, a lot of the time there were 13 aboard. It actually occurred 74 times. But we broke that just recently. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. This is the entire history of human spaceflight. This is 22,000. There are 22,000 data points on this graph. It's the reason I'm afraid this talk is going to crash, because it's there's so much data in here. But as you can see very clearly, Mercury, Gemini, Apollo here. But actually, I have this labeled to help you out a little bit. Again, Mercury, 1 person. Gemini, all the Apollo flights. These are the Skylab missions. Here is space shuttle. This is the entire duration. And again, you can see those mission deserts. This is between Mercury and Gemini, between Gemini and Apollo. This is between Apollo and the space shuttle. And this is after the space shuttle, before Dragon is flying. The other thing you can see here is I've labeled the long duration space flights. This is Mir, and then a little gap, and this is the space station. But here we have unoccupied. We have the 20 years of uninterrupted occupation of space. So let me show you some of the other data that you can get from my spreadsheet. Again, this is 22,000 days since the first launch in 1961. There have been 331 total launches on 329 dates, with 1,299. Of course, now with 4 people flying just Tuesday, that goes up to 1,303. There are only 2 days in there where there were 2 flights or 2 launches in the same day. That's surprising to me. One of those days was on purpose, and the other day was just a coincidence. So, of course, the Apollo-Soyuz test project, Apollo launched the Crew 3 and Soyuz launched the Crew 2. They linked up briefly, shook hands, and exchanged some gifts, launched on the same day. The only other one is December 2nd, 1990. Of course, there was no relationship between these 2 missions at all. The Astro 1 mission, STS-35, with a crew of 7, and Soyuz TM-11 was a mission to the space station Mir with a crew of 3. So 10 people launched on that day, and that still is the highest number of people carried into space on the same date. Of course, there's no ship that can hold that many. The maximum number of people flying on a single launch you'd think of was 7, because the space shuttle carried 7 people. But for this one mission, STS-61A, a Space Lab mission, they were able to get another seat in there, and 8 people launched on that day. So that's the largest crew that was on a space flight. The largest number that was launched on a single day was just this coincidence here in 1990. Again, the maximum person launched in a day is 10. The maximum people in space at one time, 13 on 74 days, and that held until 3 days ago, because when the New Glenn took off and was in space for about 3 minutes with Bezos and his crew of 3, they were up there for 3 minutes above the Kármán line. So there are, again, 10 people, 7 people on the space station, 3 people aboard the Chinese space station, which makes 10, plus 4 on that flight makes 14. And I haven't heard anybody mention this. I'm sure it's occurred to somebody, but it was very obvious to me that 14 people in space at the same time, even if it was about 3 minutes, sets a record. By my calculation, there's 58,871 person days in space. Of course, that goes up every day, and that's only until that covers until July 5th. So it goes up every single day. Of course, with 10 people aboard, it's climbing faster than it's ever climbed. And by my calculation, again, using the my adjustment for launch and landing each being a half day, I count nearly 25 billion person miles traveled. So I'm going to show you a bunch of other graphs which just illustrate ways of looking at this data in different ways. This is the total people launched over time. I have it here in a regular scale, and this is sorry, let me go back a little bit. I have it in this is algebraic, and this would be an exponential scale to show the earlier flights a little better. And you can see here, even at this scale, I have it labeled here, these are the mission deserts. They're very obvious here. This is, I think, the end of Gemini. This is the end of Apollo. This is this denotes the Challenger disaster, the Columbia, and the end of the shuttle. And you can see, for example, look at how few flights there were because of the gap in just the U.S. space program due to these crashes. And look at the slope here is due to all the shuttle flights plus the Soyuz flights. And look how the slope flattens out after the shuttle stops flying. That's very obvious in these graphs. I can look at launches by country. We have more than Russia, USSR, and that's partly because we have so many different vehicles. But I can also look at that by vehicle. So this is the current situation. Of course, this does not include the flight 3 days ago. This is up until July 5th, so there'd be a small slice here for the New Glenn spacecraft. But you can see that Soyuz has more launches than does the space shuttle. But if you include all the other U.S. vehicles, we have more launches than do the Russians, even including their other two. But my spreadsheet allows you to look at this not just at one point, but over time. I can look at this dynamically. So this is actually, for 22,000 days, this is the launches by vehicle as they changed. And you can see here, the only two that have a significant number of launches are Soyuz and the space shuttle. And you can see the kind of constant Soyuz. They've upgraded again many times, but they always are flying something. They've had very few gaps. But here, look at this. This is the space shuttle. This is the Challenger, Columbia, and after this space shuttle stopped flying. So now Soyuz has more flights than does the shuttle. And I look at this also in a log scale, just so you can see the earlier flights, and that at one point Mercury had more flights. And you can see here now Dragon has had some flights, and eventually that may overtake these. Shenzhou is, of course, these are the 7 flights of the Chinese launch vehicle. And then people launched. The other was just launches. This is people launched. And of course, as you'd expect, the United States has many more people launched because the space shuttle holds so many more people than does the Soyuz, for example. So we're way above any other, and I don't think we're going to get past because we have so many vehicles that are eventually with flying. I count 8 launch vehicles the U.S. has, and I think there are more in development now. But again, you can look at this by vehicle. 62% of the people that have been launched aboard the space shuttle. Dragon is a very small slice, but of course that's going to come up. And again, looking at that dynamically as well, again, Soyuz has more launches than does space shuttle. But when you look at people launched, the shuttle is far and away above Soyuz. And again, you can see this is the Challenger, Columbia, and end of ended the shuttle program. And again, on a log scale, you can see the interplay between the others, and then you can see Dragon and Shenzhou. Dragon will probably beat Shenzhou because it's going to be flying regularly with 4 people. Shenzhou only flies with 3. But you can see that the highest number of people that have flown is Space Shuttle, second is Soyuz, and even now Apollo has the third leading vehicle for the number of people flying. And then I'm going to look at the number of people in space. This is sort of like a histogram of the number of the frequency of each number. And what's interesting is that this is all the numbers of people that have been in space, 1 to 13. Of course, now there's been 14 briefly. That's not in here because my cutoff date is the 5th. It's in my data, but it's not in this talk. And so, as you might imagine, 6 and 3 are pretty common because all the most common number of people aboard the space station, the International Space Station, is either 6 or 3. Of course, now it's 7, but that's a very recent change. 2 is common because that was the capacity of many of the shuttle missions, and all the Salyut missions and a lot of the Mir missions were 2. But there's almost never 2 people in space now, so that's going to shrink. What's interesting is that the biggest number here is 0. In spite of the fact that we've been flying so much and we've been in space continuously for 20 years, the most common number of people in space since 1960 or 1961 even, is 0 people. It's not the majority anymore, but it's still the most common. If you take 0 away, again, you can see that the only real common numbers are 6 and 3 and 2 at this point. 7 is up and coming. There we go. And again, looking at this dynamically, find my mouse, there it is. You can see that for most of the history of spaceflight, 0 was the most common number. Here is where we started with continuous occupation of space, and 0. Nobody, there's never a time when there's only 0 people in space now. That may never happen again. 2 is the second most common, believe it or not, but almost never is there 2 people in space, and that may never happen again. You can see 3 and 6, again, very common, but way down here, you can see 7 and 10, which are going to be more common because there's 2 stations up there, and 7 is the common number aboard the space station now. And if you take 0 away, you can now see that these numbers are up and coming, and 2 doesn't happen anymore. It's just taking a while to change because it's too big. It's such a big talk. Again, and this is a log scale, which is very interesting. I think then you can see the interplay of the other numbers here and how this has changed. And you can look at a lot of the history of spaceflight if you look at this graph closely. And this is a table of the same thing, and it's interesting for several ways. This is the number of people in space. This is the first time it happened and the last time it happened, and the number of occurrences. So you can see we had early on an orderly progression. April 1261, Yuri Gagarin's first orbit. And then next year, 2 people. In 64, 3 people. In 65, 4 people, 5 people in 69. And then it kind of gets mixed up because different things have happened. Not so orderly anymore. And again, the most common numbers are 0, 2, 3, and 6. This is the last date it happened. And again, there's some stuff you can see about the history of spaceflight in here. The last time we had only 1 person in space was 1969. may never happen again. And in my data, July 5th, 21, 10 people, but I have to add a new row to this, 14, which happened just 3 days ago. This is person days in space, a little different way of looking at it. And again, you can see on a regular scale and a log scale, here are the mission deserts. We're approaching 60,000 person days in space now. But one of the things that I was looking for here, if I had you in person, I would ask for a show of hands of who knows Moore's law. Moore's law is a law of that it's an empirical observation of computing power, and it says that the power of semiconductors and the power of computers doubles about every 2 years. It just shows you how technology is advancing. There is no Moore's law for space flight, at least for human space flight. I looked at every log I could think of, and the number of people in space has really been pretty much constant. There's a little bit of a turn of an upslope here, but that's a very linear curve. Maybe with Starship, when that gets off the ground and can carry a lot of people, and we have different ways of getting to space, maybe that's going to change. But pretty much the number of people in space has been not too much more than constant in the last, say, 20 years or so. There just is no geometric or grand increase in the number of people as time goes up. It doesn't seem to change that much. A little bit about spaceflight safety. Talking about the 4 fatal trips, actually, with the help of Dennis and some other people from NASA, I was able to get this published last year, observing that with all the 300 and some space flights there's only been 4 fatal flights. It's kind of amazing. And again, if you Google space mishaps, there's a lot of them. And I'm amazed that there hasn't been more deaths. You look at Soyuz T-10, if you want to write that one down and Google it, I'm amazed that people did not die in that. That was not an actual launch. It's just incredible that the people survived that. But there's only been 4 actual space flights or intended space flights, in spite of the fact that there were fires and collisions and all sorts of other mishaps. But again, two Russian Soyuzes with 4 people total, and as everybody knows, the Challenger and Columbia flights, 7 each. Also, I give kind of mention to Apollo 1, only named again after the fire. That was a space vehicle, but it was not intended to be a space flight, so I didn't include that. I don't include that. And the X-15 Flight 191 was a space-worthy vehicle that broke up on descent. It reached 81 kilometers, so it did reach space by U.S. criteria, but it's not in my data as a space flight. What's amazing to me is that despite the fact that we've been flying for so long, and with 20 continuous years in orbit, there's been not a single fatality in orbit. It's actually very safe to be in orbit if you just look at the data. And no fatalities in 18 years. It's kind of amazing. Of these fatal flights, 3 were on reentry, only 1 was on ascent. These are the altitudes. So again, the only individuals who have died actually in space were these 3 on Soyuz 11, but they were on their way home, so they didn't die in orbit. Looking at it by country, there's several ways of looking at the risk of death from spaceflight. The left side here is the risk of a flight being fatal, and this is the risk of an individual dying in a flight. It's about 1 to 2% overall. So, in other words, if you board a vehicle going to space, that vehicle has about a 1.2% chance of being a fatal flight. You as an individual have about a 1.4% chance of dying. That makes space rather risky. You don't want to get in your car and know you have a 1% chance or 1.5% chance of dying. That'd be terrible. It's different by country. The risk per flight to the USSR is higher because they have 2 fatal flights in only 149 flights. We have 2 in 171 flights. So looking at it that way, we're safer. But by person, it's much worse for us because we have 14 fatalities out of 893 people that have flown, and Russia hasn't flown nearly as many people. They only have 4. So it's lower. And of course, the Chinese have had now 7 flights, 6 that are on my graphs. 7 that are on my graphs, but this was published in 2020. So I only have 6 of the flights, but they have no fatalities, but only 6 flights, 14 people by this point. The other way to look at it, which is sort of unfair but interesting, is you can look at space fatalities by mile travel, because that's the traditional way that the risk of travel is done. And we did this in the article, but we mentioned that this is not particularly fair, although it's an interesting comparison. Terrestrial travel, as you might expect, motorcycle travel is rather risky. 212 deaths per billion passenger miles. Automobile is considerably better. Rail travel is better. Bus better. And commercial air flight is very safe. 0.02 deaths per billion passenger miles. And that's, of course, because they travel so far. But it's a safe way to travel by mile. If you want to look at space flight that way, you get lots of different numbers. The overall risk of death is 0.00766 deaths per billion passenger miles. And that's because we have 58 billion miles traveled, if you want to compare it in that way. But of course, if you look at launch and landing, that's where all the deaths have occurred. Interestingly, even though there's been only 1 death or 1 fatal flight during launch and 3 fatal flights during landing, the risk is much higher during launch because the miles traveled is less. For this article, I made the assumption that the miles to space was 1,000 miles and the miles from space is 10,000 miles. So that's why the landing risk is lower by miles. And the overall launch and landing, that's where all the risk is. 1273 per billion miles traveled. But again, in orbit or beyond orbit, translunar, there's never been a death, which is very surprising considering the number of mishaps. And that's a tribute to the testing and the redundancy and all the work that's gone into spaceflight. So I'm surprised I got that done in an hour. Any questions? If you're still there.
Very interesting talk, Dr. Freiberg. Are you planning to go into space yourself when that becomes?
I would love to, but I can't pay for it. I mean, probably like many of you, I was always toying with the idea of being an astronaut. It was sort of my, one of my dream jobs. But honestly, one of the reasons I went into medicine was I knew that they're looking for advanced degrees in space, but I never pursued it like many people. Yeah, I'd love to, and if the opportunity came up, but I don't think it's going to, but I would do it if I had the chance. Yes. So one of the things that I see here is that when one of the reasons I did this, and I think what you can get out of this is anytime you're looking at history of anything, one of the challenges is to look at the details and the overall themes at the same time, sort of like looking at the forest and the trees together. And I think that looking at these graphs lets you do that. You look at the graphs, you get to see the individual flights, but you get to see at the same time on the same visual how they pertain to the total. And that's one of the things I see that this helps with.
I have a question. It's just incredibly impressive talk, and I'm just blown away by the amount of data and the way you show it. So, looking at the big picture, what do you think is the lesson for NASA here? Is that can you summarize it, or is there any hidden hidden information that doesn't emerge when you look at individual data points? When you look at it in a global perspective, there are typically some patterns that evolve, other than what you said about the difference between the Russian program and the US program, the discontinuities, the way they run the business. What would be the main takeaway looking at the big picture?
Yeah, I think that's it. I think it's the how the politics is involved in the funding, is that we don't seem to have a clear vision of what's next. I mean, right now, one of the ones that's in progress is the Orion program, the Artemis program, and it's in competition.
I'll be available in a little bit.
What? Yeah, it's. I mean, I think it's going to fly, but what's its goal? We've had many programs, and they do build on each other, but I think the politics plays maybe too much of a role in how we go from one program to another. I mean, this for me was observational, but you can see things in there. But the biggest lesson is, as you said, there's these gaps that are due to funding, and there are probably other lessons that, if you look at it closely, you may come up with.
Okay, thank you. It was a fascinating talk.
One of the things I noticed is you pointed out that most of the accidents either occur on landing or launch.
All of them, yeah.
And that's very similar to what happens with regards to aviation. Is the vast majority of the accidents are takeoff and landing. So, kind of maybe an interesting statistic to apply towards this, or an additional analysis.
Sure, if you want to improve the safety, that's where you should aim your work, and how to make those safer.
Yeah, I have a couple comments. One is, as you pointed out, your fatality rate per mile is quite low for space because of the orbits are obviously traveling very fast. Have you thought of, I think, considering the orbit as a destination, so that once you get there, you don't count those miles anymore toward that fatality? I think you kind of said that when you did launch 1,000 miles and descent 10,000, but that would be interesting as a destination. And speaking of destinations, I think you said when you counted the astronauts' time on the moon as part of the space flight. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah. That's it's orbital or beyond is the way I put it. So I mean, there were no fatalities there. I don't include. The velocity is different. Obviously, translunar and on the moon, I'm not sure what velocity you use, but at this point, there are so few moon missions that it wouldn't change the data very much in terms of miles traveled.
Right.
So I just consider them as being in orbit around the Earth at 17,500 miles an hour when they're on the moon.
Yeah, that makes sense. And looking forward, if we do go back to the moon, having a presence there for extended duration, that you might think about changing some of your definitions and criteria for permanent manned bases on the moon. For our group, we're the microgravity group, so for us, space is not just the hostile space environment of a vacuum; it's also, of course, gravity itself. So that at some point you argue, like if you go to Mars, well, you even have an atmosphere. So and you're there permanently, probably. So at some point it will change, but for what you have now, it's a very, very nice summary. Thank you.
Yeah, I also anticipate that at some point I'll have to stop doing this, because at this point, every single flight there's been is in Wikipedia. It tells you exactly who the people are, when they launched, when they landed. At some point, I think that's not going to be so easy to get anymore. When space flight gets so common that you can't look up the people, and flights are routine. But that doesn't change what's in here, at least in terms of the history of space flight. This is all still very valid. But at some point, I'm probably going to stop doing it when I can't look up the data anymore.
Yeah, sure, that makes sense.
And this data could be presented in other ways. I mean, I'd kind of like to see a coffee table book with each page being 1 year and everything labeled. I think that would be fascinating. Or an interactive display where you could click on some point on the graph and it would tell you all about that flight.
I have a couple of questions. I think Dennis had me look at some of this stuff when you were reviewing your paper, so I'm a little familiar with the info here. So just from you're thinking about the risk, we tend to think a lot about risk when we talk about space flight, and I think the data does a really, really good job, the way you've presented it, of explaining that the level of risk that you would have from a launch and a landing part of the missions. And when you're in Earth orbit, you can always return back to Earth. There's always a way to evac and get back to Earth. So that's essentially captured in your data set a much. But when we start pushing these missions past Earth's orbit to more like lunar and taking longer time in space, or into Mars and whatnot, what do you perceive from the data and the information? I mean, I know it's going to be more of a heuristic type of analysis at this point, as being the challenges to the risk to human life or to performance. I mean, your end state is your end state's kind of loss of human life, which is okay. That's a very distinct endpoint, but there are potentials for like permanent injury and other things like that from these mishaps. So what do you think are potential risks that are out there?
Well, there have been a few mishaps where there have been injuries already, but it's a big problem. I mean, I'm not a space physician, and I know they're looking at these things. What do you do when you're on the way to Mars and somebody is injured, or when somebody just has a normal? I think I point out in the paper something like appendicitis. I mean, those are going to happen at some point. There's going to be people who die in space not of medical causes, and not of causes that are related to the trip itself. Somebody has a heart attack or a stroke, and you can't come back, because right now, yes, you can evacuate. There's been a few flights that have been shortened because of medical problems, but very few, and they can come back almost instantly. But when you're on the way to the moon, especially when you're on the way to Mars, that's going to be totally different. And I know there are people working on that. I'm not working on it, but I know that they've, how far do you go in being able to do surgery or give medicines or do invasive procedures. There was a recent trip. It was published, but they don't tell you who it was, where an ultrasound revealed a clot an asymptomatic astronaut on board the space station, and they had blood thinners aboard, and they gave them, but they didn't have enough. They had to fly some aboard a mission to that person, and then figure out how to get that person home, because blood thinners are a risk when you're under more than 1G. And it's a fascinating article. Of course, it doesn't tell you again who the person was. But it was in the New England Journal of Medicine. But that kind of thing is going to happen. And I know there are people working on it, not just space mishaps, but just normal medical problems when someone's away for months or potentially years. And that's that's not my field. There are people working on that. And I'm very curious also to know what contingencies they're going to have.
Well, I think I can tell you with a little bit of a surety that not a lot is the answer. Not a lot of contingencies. But yeah, that you're talking about Katrina Marshall Goebel's study that identified that recirculation area in the jugular vein, and then
Right.
which they were fearing was going to initiate a clotting system. So yeah, so that's stagnation of fluid in the jugular. So yeah, that's well known. I mean, that's well known that they're doing research in that area. That's probably unique to microgravity in the fact that it's related to the fluid redistribution that in changes in pressure in the thoracic space that they were not aware of. But you make a fair point about all the it's going to happen. There's been enough evidence of just what could happen in short periods of time that something on a longer period would definitely be something that we have to worry about. So thank you.
So I know years ago, I think I may have been muted. Years ago, they were talking about creating gravity on the way to Mars. I remember looking at back in the 70s, I think they were talking about spinning the craft and creating artificial gravity, but I don't hear about that.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak a little bit about that because we've done some research work in what's called the short arm centrifuge idea, where we would put because spinning the whole craft is expensive because it requires more structural support, things like that. It's possible to do what's called a short arm centrifuge, where you would provide artificial gravity along a short arm. The center of rotation is typically at the neurovestibular point in the head, so it's right almost straight through the middle of the head. So you're spinning around that way to produce a short-term gravity effect on both the muscle, bone, fluid redistribution, things like that have looked at. And you can get some really interesting results. There's not enough really to prove that it's beneficial yet for what the cost would be, but it comes and goes constantly. Every 5 years or so, somebody brings it back up as another idea and another way we could use it. So I expect eventually we'll test it in space on a regular basis. But right now it's probably a little further out there.
Not even in animals? They haven't tested it in animals?
There are small animal centrifuges they use, especially the Japanese centrifuge that uses mice. That's more in the space biology area, so some of our other branch members may have more insight into that than I have. But they do that. It requires a lot of astronaut time to do those analyses.
Anything else? Oh, I think I am there.
Oh. Andy, I wanted to make sure to pass on David's thanks for the nice presentation. He had to sign off and go to another meeting, but yeah, I enjoyed seeing your work presented. So yeah, it's fascinating being able to look through it all.
And if I may, Dennis, Andy, if you have the opportunity in about the February timeframe, there is a what's called the Human Research Programs Investigators Workshop, which I think you might enjoy attending, just to see. I think you'll see some of the things you're talking about might pop up in that area. So if you're interested, and you being a pediatric oncologist, it might pique your interest on some of the work that's done to try to prevent astronauts from getting long-term elevated risk for cancer.
Yep.
So
yeah, I'd like to know more about that. Do they have posters at that?
yes, they do.
Okay.
Yes, they do have posters, presentations, all sorts of stuff. We can definitely talk. I mean, definitely. I'll send you some, or I'll send it to Dennis, or Dennis, you can send me a link or whatever, and I can send you the announcement when it comes out. They're just now planning it at the moment, but it's usually around the February timeframe that they have this meeting.
And I'd love to present this to other groups. I don't know if like, for example, some of the astronauts would like to see this. If they have a forum.
They will definitely be there. I don't know if they'll be, if a lot of them will be there, but they'll
Or
definitely be there. Especially all the astronauts that are medical doctors will be there.
Or some other meeting for any other NASA groups that might be interested in hearing this.
There's AIAA meetings. There's ASGSR meetings. There's quite a few that might be interested in hearing it. Definitely.
Because up until now, I've been keeping it to myself. So thanks, everybody. If there's nothing more.
I just want to, can you make your slides available to us? Your presentation.
Yes, it's a very big talk, so it's not possible to email it.
Okay.
I can scan it. I might be able to get it on Google Drive or something like that. But this talk is huge, and
right, I understand that.
Even one slide is too big to send.
Yeah.
But we can figure out a way.
Okay.
All right. So
Again,
John, any closing comments or?
I've got nothing. So other than, again, David expressed his thank you. He had to attend another meeting, so.
okay.
Yeah.
Yep, thank you.